Nobody in Callan's Creek could agree on much, but they all agreed that Frances Pearson had the sharpest tongue west of the ridge and the straightest spine in the entire valley. She didn't ask for help. She didn't accept it either. And she certainly didn't tolerate careless men who couldn't watch where they were going. So when Jesse Harrington walked into her life and broke the one thing she had saved 3 months to buy, something between them cracked open too, and neither of them would be the same after that afternoon. The vase had come all the way from a catalog store in San Antonio. Frances had ordered it in the early spring, paid for it in careful installments, and finally collected it from the freight office that very morning. It was pale blue with a thin painted border of wildflowers around the neck, nothing extravagant, and nothing that would turn heads. But it was hers, chosen by her, paid for by her, carried home by her own 2 hands, wrapped carefully in brown paper and twine. She had just set it on the corner table inside Pearson's General Store, the shop her father had built, and she had run alone for the past 2 years, when Jesse Harrington pushed through the front door without knocking. He never knocked. That was the first thing Frances had always disliked about him. Jesse Harrington was not a bad man. Most people in Callan's Creek would tell you that plainly. He ran a modest horse operation on the eastern edge of town, paid his debts on time, and had never once started a fight, though he had finished a few. He was tall in the way that took up a room without trying, and he had a habit of speaking slowly that some people found calm and Frances found insufferable. He wanted to purchase feed on credit. Again. Frances had extended him credit twice that season already, and both times he had paid her back, fairly, without complaint. But she kept a careful ledger, and she kept it her way, and she did not appreciate the casual manner in which Jesse Harrington seemed to believe her store operated as a personal convenience for him and his horses. "I'll have it settled by Friday," he said, leaning one arm against the counter like he owned the wall behind it. "You said that in March," Frances replied, not looking up from her ledger. "And I paid you in March." "You paid me the following Tuesday." He exhaled slowly through his nose. "That is still March, Miss Pearson." She looked up then. Well, that was her mistake. Or his, because the look she gave him carried enough heat to start a fire in wet grass. And Jesse, rather than taking a step back the way most men did, simply held her gaze without blinking. That was the second thing she disliked about him. The argument that followed was not their first, and it was not their loudest. But it was the one that mattered. It began over credit terms. It moved, the way their arguments always moved, through a series of grievances that had been quietly stacking for months. The time he had let his fence post lean onto her delivery path. The morning his horse had gotten loose and knocked over her outdoor display. The general and persistent fact of his existence in her town, in her store, in her carefully ordered world. Jesse was not a man who raised his voice, but he was a man who held his ground, and the more Frances pushed, the stiller he became, and somehow that stillness made her push harder. She turned sharply mid-sentence to point toward the door, to gesture, to emphasize, to make the kind of point that ends conversations, and her elbow caught the corner table. The pale blue vase tipped. For one breathless moment it seemed like it might right itself. It did not. The sound it made against the hardwood floor was small and final. The kind of sound that doesn't echo. It simply stops, and then there is silence, and the silence is worse than the breaking. Frances stood completely still. She stared at the pieces, the pale blue shards scattered across the floor, the painted wildflowers now split apart, at the brown paper she hadn't even fully unwrapped yet, still sitting on the table beside nothing. Jesse looked at the floor, then at her. then at the floor again. "Frances, don't!" Her voice was quiet, quieter than he had ever heard it. He crouched down before she could stop him and began gathering the larger pieces carefully with both hands. "Leave it." She said it without looking at him. He didn't leave it. That was the moment something shifted, though neither of them would have named it that way at the time. Frances watched Jessie Harrington kneel on her floor and collect the broken pieces of her vase with the same careful hands he used on injured horses, and she felt something she had no vocabulary for and no interest in examining. So she buried it the only way she knew how. "This is your fault," she said. Jessie set the pieces on the counter and stood. He didn't argue. He didn't apologize the way men apologized when they wanted to be forgiven quickly. He just looked at her, that slow, unhurried look, and said, "I know." 2 words, and somehow they made everything worse. "I want it replaced," she said. "All right. I'm not asking. I am telling you. I heard you the first time, Miss Pearson." She stepped closer without meaning to. "And I want you to understand something else while you're standing in my store." Her voice had come back now, full and firm, and carrying the particular edge that made younger men excuse themselves. "I don't know what kind of woman you think I am. I don't know if it's the credit you keep asking for or the way you walk in here, like you've got some kind of standing. But I want it understood, clearly, or between you and me and God himself, that I will never," she pressed the word down hard, "never marry you, Jessie Harrington, not if you were the last man between here and the Pacific." The store was very quiet. Outside, a wagon rolled slowly down the main road. A dog barked once and stopped. Jessie looked at her for a long moment. He picked up his hat from the counter where he'd set it. He turned it once in his hands. And then, and this was the part Frances would think about later, alone, in the dark, more times than she would ever admit, he smiled. Not a wide smile, not a smug one, just a small, private thing that had no business being on his face in that moment. He leaned just slightly toward her, and in a voice so low she almost missed it, he said, "I'll only marry you, Frances Pearson." Then he put his hat on, nodded once, and walked out the door. Frances stood in her store, surrounded by broken pieces of pale blue porcelain, and said nothing for a very long time. She told herself it meant nothing. Men said foolish things when they were caught off guard. It was bluster. It was pride talking back, the way pride sometimes dressed itself up in soft words to avoid looking small. Jessie Harrington was not a man who thought about what he said. He was a man who fixed fences and traded horses, and had no business saying things like that, in that particular voice, at that particular moment. She swept up the remaining pieces herself. She refused to let her hands shake while she did it. But that night, sitting at the small table in the back room where she kept her books, Frances found herself pausing over the ledger with her pen held still above the page. She was not thinking about the vase. She was not thinking about the credit balance. She was thinking about the way a man she had known for 2 years, and disliked for most of them, had looked at her just before he walked out, like he already knew something about the future that she hadn't been told yet. And for the first time in a long time, Frances Pearson didn't know what came next. Frances did not sleep well that night. She told herself it was the humidity. July in Callan's Creek had a way of sitting heavy on the chest, thick and still, the kind of heat that made even the dogs lie flat and motionless on porch boards until well past midnight. It had nothing to do with Jessie Harrington, or the quiet way he had said what he said, or the fact that she had replayed it, involuntarily, but she insisted to herself, at least 4 times before the candle burned down. She was up before dawn. That was normal. She had the store open, and the ledger balanced before the first customer came through the door. That was also normal. What was not normal was that she kept looking up every time the door opened. Jessie didn't come in that day, or the next. By the third morning, Frances had decided this was perfectly fine. Better than fine. It was exactly what she had wanted. The man gone from her counter, gone from her doorway, gone from the particular corner of her life she had not invited him into in the first place. She had enough to manage without Jesse Harrington and his horses, and his slow way of looking at things. She told herself this while reorganizing a shelf that didn't need reorganizing. And she told herself this again while walking past the corner table, bare now, nothing on it, on her way to the back room. On the fourth day, old Hector Briggs came in for tobacco and flour and mentioned, without any particular intention, that Jesse Harrington had ridden out to Millward to source some materials. "What kind of materials?" Frances asked before she could stop herself. Hector looked at her over his spectacles. "Didn't ask," he said pleasantly. Frances went back to her ledger and said nothing more about it. Jesse returned on a Friday. He didn't come to the store. He came to the side door, the one that opened directly from the alley into the small back room where Frances did her bookkeeping, and he knocked 3 times, evenly spaced. The kind of knock that wasn't in a hurry. Frances set down her pen, but she considered not answering. She considered it seriously for a full 10 seconds before she stood and opened the door. Jesse was holding something wrapped in cloth, not brown paper and twine, proper cloth, folded neatly at the corners the way someone had taken time over it. He held it out without a word. Frances looked at it, then at him. "What is this?" "Open it." She almost said she didn't want to, but her hands had already taken it, and the cloth fell away before she'd made any conscious decision. And there it was. A vase. Not identical to hers. Different shape, slightly taller, with a wider mouth, but pale blue, and around the neck, painted in careful thin strokes, a border of wildflowers. Frances said nothing for a moment. "It's not the same," Jesse said. He wasn't making an excuse. He was just saying it plainly, the way he said most things. "The man in Millward does painted pottery. I described yours as best I could. He said the flowers are larkspur. Yours had something different. I don't know what they were." "Blue bonnets," Frances said quietly. "Right." He nodded. He didn't have the pattern, but he said larkspur is close. Frances turned the vase slowly in her hands. The painting was careful work. Someone had spent time on it. The blue was a shade deeper than her original, richer almost, and the flowers curved around the neck with a kind of unhurried grace that her catalog vase, she now realized, had not quite had. It was, if she was being honest with herself, lovelier than the one she'd lost. She was not ready to be honest with herself. "This doesn't settle anything," she said. "I know. I'm still putting the replacement cost in the ledger." "That's fair." She looked up at him. He was watching her with that expression she couldn't categorize, not quite patient, not quite amused, somewhere in the space between the two where she had no reliable footing. "Why did you go all the way to Millward?" she asked. "Because that's where the man was," Jesse said simply. It was not an answer. It was also entirely an answer. Frances chose not to pursue it. She put the vase on the corner table that evening after she closed the store. It looked right there. She didn't want to think about why that bothered her. The trouble, the real trouble, the kind that couldn't be swept up and disposed of like porcelain pieces, started 2 weeks later when Frances discovered that the building next to her store had been quietly purchased. And she learned this the way she learned most unwelcome things, from Hector Briggs over tobacco and flour. "Harrington picked it up from old Dunfield," Hector said, casual as weather talk. "Going to expand his operation. Board the horses closer to town during the trading season, I expect." Francis set down the flour scoop. "He bought the building next to my store." "Right next door," Hector confirmed, with the satisfied nod of a man who had just delivered interesting news and knew it. She found Jesse at the building that same afternoon. He was inside measuring the floor space with a length of rope, moving along the wall with the unhurried focus of a man who had already decided what he was going to do and was simply confirming what he already knew. "You bought this building," Francis said from the doorway. Jesse looked up. "I did. Without mentioning it. It wasn't your business to mention it to." That was technically true. Francis hated that it was technically true. "You are going to be running horses 15 feet from my store." 12, Jesse said, measuring again. "Closer to 12? She stepped inside. The building smelled of old wood and dust, and the particular emptiness of a space that had been vacant too long. "Do you understand what that means for my customers? The noise alone, I'll keep the noise managed. The smell, I'll keep that managed too. You can't just—" She stopped herself, took a breath. "Jesse, why this building?" He coiled the measuring rope slowly in his hands. He looked at her in that way, the way she was beginning to recognize as the one that meant he was about to say something she wasn't prepared for. "It's a good location," he said. "There are other good locations. Not this good." The space between them in the empty building felt different than the space between them in her store. Bigger, somehow. Or smaller. Francis couldn't decide which, and that uncertainty irritated her more than the building purchase had. "I think you're doing this deliberately," she said. Jesse tilted his head slightly. "Doing what deliberately?" "Being," she gestured vaguely, "near." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "A man can't buy a building near a woman? Not when the woman has made herself clear." "You made yourself clear about marriage," Jesse said. "I haven't asked you anything about marriage, Miss Pearson. I bought a building." She opened her mouth, closed it. He was right, and they both knew it. Oh, and the fact that he was right without being smug about it was somehow the most aggravating thing he had ever done. And he had done a considerable number of aggravating things. She turned and walked out. Jesse watched her go. He didn't call after her. He just stood in his empty building with his measuring rope and the quiet, particular expression of a man who was not in any kind of hurry. The weeks that followed were not easy ones. Jesse's operation moved in gradually. Boards delivered, a small corral constructed along the back, 2 hired hands, who were polite and kept themselves to themselves. He had, true to his word, kept the noise managed. The smell was not a problem. The horses were calm animals, well kept, and the customers who came into Francis's store barely seemed to notice the new activity next door, when this made things considerably worse, because Francis had prepared herself for a fight. She had sharpened her objections, organized her grievances, and was fully ready to march next door with a list of legitimate complaints the moment any one of them materialized. And none of them did. Jesse Harrington ran a clean, quiet operation and gave her absolutely nothing to push against. She caught herself watching from the store window sometimes. Just briefly. Just long enough to see him working, mending something, speaking low to one of the horses, handing instructions to his hired men with the same unhurried calm he brought to everything. She always found something else to look at before he could turn around. It was a Wednesday evening in late August, when the storm came in from the north without much warning. But Francis had stayed late over the books, and by the time she realized how dark the sky had gotten, The wind had already picked up enough to rattle the store's front window in its frame. She moved quickly, closing shutters, pulling in the small outdoor display she kept near the door, securing the latch on the storage room. She was reaching for the last shutter on the side wall, the one that always stuck, when she heard boots on the steps behind her. Jesse was already there. He reached past her without a word and worked the shutter free with one firm pull, latching it cleanly in a single motion. Frances stepped back. The wind was loud now, and the first drops of rain had started, fat, cold, widely spaced in the way that comes just before everything opens up. "You should get inside," Jesse said. He wasn't looking at her, but he was checking the latch. "I know what I should do," she said. He turned then. They were close, closer than the store counter, closer than the empty building, close enough that the wind between them felt personal. Rain hit the roof of the awning above in a sudden hard sheet, and they both stood still beneath it, without stepping apart. Jesse looked at her. Not the measuring look, not the patient one. Something quieter than both of those, and Frances felt it land somewhere below her ribs, in a place she had been carefully guarding for a very long time. "Come inside," she said. It came out differently than she intended, less like a dismissal, more like something else entirely. Jesse held her gaze for one long moment. Then he nodded and followed her in, and Frances closed the door behind them both as the storm broke wide open over Callan's Creek. She stood with her back to the door, and her heart doing something she refused to name. Across the room, Jesse set his hat on the counter, her counter, in her store, in the life she had built alone, and looked out the rain-streaked window like a man who had nowhere else he'd rather be. And Frances Pearson, who had never in her life been uncertain about a single thing she wanted, stood in the dark and the rain, and felt, for the first time, genuinely uncertain. Not about him, about herself. The storm lasted through the night. Frances made coffee. It seemed like the practical thing to do, the sensible, unremarkable thing that two people sharing a space during a storm might do without it, meaning anything at all. Yet she moved around the back room with purpose, filling the kettle, setting the cups, keeping her hands busy in the way she always kept her hands busy when her mind was somewhere she didn't want it to be. Jesse sat in the chair across from her small work table. He didn't fill the silence with talk. He didn't try to make the situation comfortable or uncomfortable. He simply sat, the way he did everything, without apology, without performance, and accepted the cup she set in front of him with a quiet thank you that she felt more than heard. The rain hammered the roof steadily. Outside, Callan's Creek was dark and empty and running with water. Inside, the lamp on Frances's work table made everything amber and close. They talked, not about the building next door, but not about the ledger or the credit balance or the broken vase or any of the things that had built up between them like stones in a dry riverbed. They talked the way people talk when a storm has removed all the usual reasons not to, carefully at first, then less carefully, then not carefully at all. Jesse told her about the horse operation, not the business of it, the actual work of it, the way a frightened animal needed patience above everything else, the way you couldn't rush trust, the way some horses came to you damaged, and it took a full season just to teach them that a calm hand wasn't a trick. Frances listened in the particular way she rarely allowed herself to listen to anyone, without preparing her response, without measuring the words against what she already thought, just listening. She told him about the store, Not the ledger side of it, the other side. How her father had built it board by board over one summer and let her paint the front door at age 7. How she had repainted that same door herself the spring after he died, matching the color as close as she could from memory. How running it alone was not something she had chosen so much as something she had simply decided to be equal to. Jesse watched her while she talked, not impatiently, not with the look of a man waiting for a pause so he could speak. He watched her the way you watch something that matters. "You've never asked for help," he said. It wasn't a criticism. "I've never needed it," Francis said. He nodded slowly. There's a difference between not needing something and not allowing it. Francis looked at him across the small table. The lamp flickered once in a draft from somewhere and steadied again. "I know the difference," she said quietly. "I think you do," he said. "I think that's what makes it harder." She didn't answer that, but she didn't look away either. The rain softened toward midnight, not stopping, just easing into the long, steady kind that meant it had settled in for the duration and wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. Jesse stood to go. Francis walked him to the door. She opened it, and they both looked out at the wet, empty street, the puddles silver under the low cloud, the air smelling of soaked earth and cedar, and the particular clean that only comes after a hard rain. "Jesse," she said. He turned. She had not planned what came next, yet she had not organized it or examined it, or run it through the careful internal process she applied to every decision she made. It came out simply, the way true things sometimes do when you stop working so hard against them. "The vase you brought me," she said. "It's better than the one I lost." Jesse was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad," he said. "I'm not saying that to be kind." "I know you're not," he said. "You don't say things to be kind. You say things because you mean them." She folded her arms, not defensively, just to have something to do with her hands. "That's not always a compliment. It is from where I'm standing." The rain came down soft and steady between them. A horse moved in the corral next door, a quiet shuffling sound in the dark. Francis looked at him standing in her doorway with rain on his hat brim, and that expression she had spent months trying to name. And she thought about damaged horses and long seasons, and the particular patience required to teach something that a calm hand wasn't a trick. She thought about a pale blue vase and a man who had ridden to Millward and back without being asked. She thought about all the things she had decided to be equal to, alone, for 2 years. "Good night, Jesse," she said. "Good night, Francis." He stepped off the porch into the rain. She watched him cross the 12 feet between her door and his, and she stood there until his light came on behind his window, and then she closed her door and leaned against it in the dark for a long moment. Her heart was doing that thing again. This time she let it. September came in cool and golden, the way it sometimes did in that part of Texas, as if the land itself had decided to make up for the hard summer. The trading season picked up. The store was busy. Jesse's operation next door moved through its rhythm. Horses in and out, quiet work, the occasional low conversation between him and his men carrying through the shared wall on still mornings. Francis stopped bracing every time she heard it. Things shifted between them the way things shift when two people have shared a storm, and neither of them has pretended otherwise. Not dramatically. Not with any single moment that could be pointed to later. Just a gradual, honest thawing, the way ground warms in early spring, from the inside out, slowly and without announcement. Yet he started coming in for supplies in the morning rather than letting credit pile up. She stopped noting the time of his payments in the ledger. He held the side door when her hands were full. She left coffee on the back table on cold mornings without saying anything about it. They disagreed about things regularly. Jessie thought she priced her dry goods too low. Francis thought he trusted new buyers too quickly. They said so plainly to each other without heat, the way people argue when they have stopped needing to win. Old Hector Briggs noticed. He noticed in the way old men notice things they have been quietly waiting on, with satisfaction and the wisdom to say absolutely nothing. It was a Tuesday in late October when Jessie asked her to walk with him, not to discuss anything, not to settle anything between them, just to walk, out along the north edge of town, where the land opened up, and the sky got wide, and the autumn grass had gone the color of old copper in the evening light. Francis said yes before she'd thought about whether to. They walked without urgency, and the conversation moved the way their conversations had learned to move, easy, honest, unguarded. The sun dropped low and painted everything in long, warm shades, and Francis felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Something she didn't have a cautious word for and was no longer looking for one. Jessie stopped walking. She stopped too and looked at him, and found him already looking at her, not with the patient expression or the measuring one, but something she recognized now because she had seen it in herself recently, reflected back in unexpected quiet moments. Something certain and soft at once. "I meant what I said," Jessie told her, back in the store, that day. Francis held his gaze. "I know you did. I'm not asking you for an answer tonight," he said. "I just wanted you to know it still stands. It'll keep standing." The wind moved through the copper grass around them. The sky above Callan's Creek had gone deep and clear and full of early stars. Francis looked at this man, stubborn, patient, careful with broken things, and felt the last of whatever she had been holding closed simply let go. "You're going to make me say it, aren't you?" she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "I'm not going to make you do anything, Francis." "I know that too," she said quietly. She took one step toward him, then another. And when she was close enough that the space between them was no longer something either of them could reasonably call distance, she looked up at him and said plainly, in the voice she used for things she meant completely, "Ask me." Jessie looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, simply, and without theater, "Will you marry me, Francis Pearson?" It wasn't even quite a question. It was the kind of sentence that already knew its answer. "Yes," she said, "I will." They were married on a Saturday in December in the small church at the end of Callan's Creek's main road, with Hector Briggs sitting in the front pew looking thoroughly unsurprised. Frances wore her mother's dress, altered at the sleeves. Jessie wore a dark coat she had not seen before, and suspected he had purchased specifically for the occasion, which she found quietly and completely endearing. The front door of Pearson's general store was painted fresh that morning, the same color it had always been, matched from memory. Jessie had done it before dawn without telling her, and when Frances saw it, she stood on the porch steps for a long moment and said nothing, which was how Jessie had come to know she was most moved. He stood beside her and said nothing either. That was enough. That was more than enough. In the years that followed, the store and the horse operation grew. Not fast, not carelessly, but the way things grow when two people tend them together with patience and honesty, and the particular stubbornness of two people who know how to hold their ground and have learned at last who is worth holding it beside. They had 2 children, a boy first, then a girl. And the boy had Jessie's unhurried way of moving through a room. The girl had Frances's eyes and her complete unwillingness to leave anything unfinished. The pale blue vase sat on the corner table for all of it, through trading seasons and hard winters and the ordinary, irreplaceable days of a life built by hand. Frances dusted it every week, Jessie never mentioned it. But sometimes, on quiet evenings when the store was closed and the children were settled and the lamp was low on the work table, he would look at it from across the room. That small, private smile on his face, the one that had no business being there and always was. And Frances would look at him, looking at it. And she would think about a broken thing and a long ride and a man who had come back with something better. She never told him it was her favorite thing in the house, and she suspected he already knew.